The Mine Robber, it's one of those stories that, given all it had to face, it's a miracle anything even remotely watchable ended up on the screen. It came at the end of the fifth production block of Doctor Who, which had been running non-stop for the best part of 11 months, so naturally, those who had been going non-stop over that entire period, chiefly a Mr. P. Troughton of London, were somewhat tired. Scripting problems with the Dominators, namely that it was the Dominators, meant that it had to be reduced from 6 episodes to 5, meaning that the extra episode would have to be bolted onto this story without the minor luxuries of any extra actors or sets to actually do anything with. This meant, in order to prevent their lead actor from collapsing from exhaustion, storming up in a huff, or both, all 5 episodes had to be edited down to be around the shortest in the show's history, the episodes coming in at about 20 minutes each as opposed to nearer 24 as usual. Then suddenly, another of your lead actors decides to go and get chickenpox and needs to be quarantined, so that requires further changes. Consider all of this is with a writer that has no experience with science fiction, and is writing a fantastical and surreal high-concept story, and with a director who hasn't directed for the show before. Well, considering several New Who episodes became complete disasters solely through the lead writer's inability or refusal to do any delegating, that The Mind Robber ended up as a coherent and competently made story, never mind the very highly regarded one considered a highlight of his era, is a testament to it and those making it. Despite having been working on the series for nearly a year straight, Patrick Troughton nevertheless listed this as a favourite story of his, and it's not terribly difficult to see why he might think that. After a year of Base on the Siege stories, several of which are admittedly quite good, having something so radically different would no doubt have been welcome for him. The Mind Robber is indeed the highlight of its era. Not perfect, and some of the issues I suspect may not have been entirely unrelated to the pressures its production faced, but its status as an imaginative, intelligent, and entertaining piece nevertheless stand. Season 6 is a polarised season in my view. The Dominators and the Space Pirates created an unmistakable stink that's difficult to ignore, but with the invasions and the war games, it's had another nice perfume to mask it, and this story very much falls in category B. So let's look at the previously mentioned issues and how they make the story what it is. The Dominators being such a disaster meant that its 6th episode had to be binned as part of the complicated procedure of making our audience suffer for 25 fewer minutes than they otherwise would have to, meaning that extra episode had to go somewhere, and that somewhere was at the beginning of The Mind Robber. The issue was, well, they couldn't just add an extra episode onto the existing story. That would require sets they hadn't built and actors they couldn't afford to pay for an extra week. At their disposal, they had the bare minimum: Patrick Troughton, Frazer Hines, Wendy Padbury, the TARDIS set, and some studio space that they could do anything with as long as it didn't actually involve anything. They managed to wrangle some robot costumes from another sci-fi series. I haven't found out if this was unplanned and then added into the later part of the stories to link them to the first episodes, or if they were always planned to be used later and they just got them earlier on, but my guess is the former, as their presence in the land of fiction is never really explained and their job could quite easily be done by the toy soldiers. But either way, it does show some forethought and planning that those who make New Who have decided isn't really necessary, we can just use explosions to cover things instead. Anywho, this meant that the first episode is a wildly different beast from the other 4. Being a tense, surreal piece that does such a good job of setting up the story as a whole, it would honestly come as a surprise to anyone who didn't know that it was a last-minute addition. It's a brilliantly unsettling piece. The White Void is honestly one of the most creepy effects Classic Who ever pulled off, and while the sound design is something I'll praise later for the whole story, it's particularly effective here. Director David Maloney later on became one of Classic Who's most celebrated, directing classics like The War Games, Genesis to the Daleks and The Deadly Assassin, but as I mentioned, this was his first time directing the series. Even from this though, it's easy to see why he became so celebrated, because his work on this first episode in particular is phenomenal. The atmosphere is chillingly unsettling, and the fact there's only really about 10 minutes of plot to fill out this 20-minute episode allows him to take his time, meaning things are allowed to stick with us. When Jamie and Zoe see their homes on the scanner, that the shots are allowed to linger drive home how strange and creepy this really is, and bear in mind, it's just being done with some stock images and music. It's also impressive that the sense of urgency he derives from the most basic things, the actors just reading numbers and pretending to be overwhelmed, is made to be incredibly tense through the combination of the sound design and Maloney's work. Also, obviously credit goes to the original sci-fi series that made them, but these are brilliant looking robots, aren't they? They look unsettling enough to add to the feeling. Of course, the other element that makes this work is the efforts of the actors themselves. Patrick Troughton, in my view, was an absolutely phenomenal actor, probably the best to ever take the role, and he shines in this entire story, but episode 1 in particular. Even when he was completely exhausted, he still turns in a 10 out of 10 performance. All the subtleties are effortlessly conveyed. Saying this kind of silliness with utter sincerity is not easy, and he does it brilliantly. Frazer Hines, of course, has more than a handle on Jamie at this point, and he is brilliant as always, and despite this only being Wendy Padbury's third story, she's already settled into the part of Zoe and shows why her addition was such a positive for this season. Now, I'm going to get into this later, but to cut a very long story short, I do like the character of Victoria, but it's plain that Zoe was the much better character, and crucially the much better third wheel between the Doctor and Jamie. As I said, I'll be delving into this a bit later. But full credit goes to Padbury to rising to the occasion here. In particular, she bounces brilliantly off Troughton. All three of them do brilliantly throughout the whole story, particularly the first episode, as, after all, they're the ones you needed to carry it. So with the first episode sorted out and the others edited down to around the 20 rather than 23-minute mark to keep Patrick Troughton happy, this wasn't particularly burdensome as it's not exactly a plot-heavy story, as I'll get to, all looked like it was finally going well. And then Frazer Hines, the silly sod, went and got chickenpox and had to be quarantined. And suddenly the dial had to be turned from not buggered back to buggered again. Now, the obvious choice would be to do what frequently happened in the 60s when the leads weren't available, just shove them out of the way for the length of the episode and write in some easy explanation. However, they didn't do that. They did something I always think is a sign of a great production team. They took a problem and turned it into a potential story advantage. Using an insert, which I presume they filmed a bit later when Hines was available again, Jamie gets shot and turned into a bit of cardboard. The Doctor has to arrange his face again, but does it wrong. Whoops. Now, this was an advantage in two ways. Firstly, it reinforced the unsettling, surreal nature of the world they had arrived in, and secondly, by adding a small bit of character work, the Doctor trying to cover up to Zoe that it was his fault and eventually getting found out. It's a nice bit that shows our hero isn't flawless and that Zoe is not overawed by the Doctor. She's happy to call him out when he's done fucked up, and that's a small but worthwhile bit. The actor they bring in to play Jamie for episode 2, Hamish Wilson, does an okay job. He doesn't bring anything like as much to the charm and likability that the role that Hines managed on a weekly basis, but it was a very short notice and all he had to do was to do the accent and say the lines in a way that didn't sound shite, and he manages that, so well done him. So yeah, it's a very good example of turning a problem into an advantage. Always a good sign. Anyway, let's take a look at episodes 2 to 5, and we'll start with the production side. Maloney once again shows why he would become such a respected director for the series, with a perfect tone achieved throughout. The unsettling nature of the first episode continues into the second, but as the plot progresses and develops, this transitions into a fantastical atmosphere, one where it feels natural to be in a situation they are in despite its weirdness, which allows the plot to progress. The fact that, combining the shorter than usual episodes and the quite sedate pace of the script, not an awful amount actually happens in every episode, is masked by Maloney keeping the pacing at the perfect level. Not too fast, but not too slow either. Again, the plot is allowed to progress, but the atmosphere is allowed to stick. Maloney also does a great job of integrating the special effects. The Medusa scene, using what looks like stop motion to me, and if you're hearing this I didn't bother to check, sorry, is integrated with the actors about as well as could be hoped given the time period. Stuff like this is far from perfect, but it's aged a hell of a lot better than the shitty CGI from early New Who. Medusa looks way better than the Krillitanes from last time, I'll tell you that much, so yeah, Maloney's direction is a major reason why the story succeeds. All of this means, however, that we have a great deal to be thankful to Ian Levine for, and yes, I know that's a sentence not often said. Had he not located this story amongst other 60s episodes waiting to be junked back in 1978, episodes 1 to 4 would have been lost forever, as no other copies of the story have ever surfaced. Episode 5 would have existed because of the 35mm broadcast print which remained in the film library, but that would have been it. So whatever else he's done over the years, we can thank him for that. That's gotta be worth Doctor in Distress, right? Right? Anyway, the other major elements on the production side that work are the sound and production design. The sounds are great and a major part of why the atmosphere works as well as it does. The sound of the toy robots, for instance, marching along could easily have sounded cheesy, but it manages to transcend the line to become even slightly menacing despite, on the surface, being pretty silly. The Medusa scene works as well as it does because of the menacing yet subtle sound she's given, and most importantly, the ambient sounds do well at conveying that atmosphere. Equally, the production designer pulled out all the stops here. The toy robots again should look insanely cheesy and naff. One only needs to look at the Candyman 20 years later for how it could have gone, but while they do have that 60s naff charm to them, they do look pretty imposing and like there's something for our heroes to be wary of. Most of the characters look great, the final battle between the Doctor and the Master of Fiction's characters looks so impressive given the time and budget, and the castle itself is quite a decent set given everything. The costume designers also deserve credit, especially for the carcass, which perfectly captures the rubbish pulp sci-fi villain charm. Never mind coming from the hourly telepress of the year 2000, he wouldn't be out of place in a low-budget black and white 60s sci-fi show anyway, yeah, the designers all around do a brilliant job of realising this story. It's clear they relish the concept and put their all into it, and frankly, after a year of Base Under Siege stories, who can really blame them? So, the script. This was Peter Ling's first, and indeed only, script for the programme, and indeed, given that and the problems they encountered I listed at the start, it is a miracle the mind robber turned out as well as it did. Unfortunately though, the script ain't flawless, so I'll get the negative stuff out of the way so I can focus on the large amount of stuff that does work later on. The biggest issue with this story is that the ideas, which are brilliant, don't 100% translate into a full finished story. It gets maybe 90% of the way there, but the narrative beats don't quite join up all the way. It's telling that despite having the best part of 15 minutes or so shaved off the runtime of his initial 4 episodes, they still feel pretty padded. Ground gets retreaded several times as we go along. The first time the Doctor and Zoe realise they can defeat the creatures they face by accepting their fictional nature is a fascinating clue into the way this world works and what they can do to survive here. By the third or fourth time, it's a bit old. There are 2 cliffhangers relying on this idea. Having a slow pace is fine. One of the reasons I think Classic Who is superior to New Who is because it's allowed to take its time, but none of it's just retreading ground in order to fill out the runtime. It just doesn't feel like there's quite enough story here to fill out 4 episodes, never mind 4 plus a prologue. The shorter episodes mean it can feel like nothing has actually happened throughout an episode, which is never a great feeling to have. The story does also lose me a bit when we come to the actual big bad himself. The Master is a great concept well executed, an imaginative writer taken by a computer that needs imagination to do its bidding. And well, he's a very accomplished writer.
Did you ever hear of the adventures of Captain Jack Hawk?
Oh no.
Away.
Oh, thank goodness for that. I can't think of anything more dastardly than making the Doctor go up against the writers of Torchwood. The Master also had the advantage of being a villain being performed very well. Emery Jones switches between menacing and soft effortlessly, and he has an absolutely brilliant voice that works really well with the voiceover as early on. That, combined with the mystery of what's happening, makes him a very effective presence in the early episodes. The issue, therefore, is that the computer itself, the one that's controlling him, is just not a particularly engaging villain. For a computer that's gone to such trouble to create a bizarro, surreal world, the endgame being a generic "and then we'll take over the world" plot is a disappointment. The ending is also rushed and disjointed. The fight between the Doctor and the Master through fictional characters is fantastic, and something I'd like to have gone further, until they're summoning Godzilla and King Kong to go at it. Obviously it wouldn't have been doable on the budget, but we can dream. What doesn't work is a Bizarro washed, and now we'll overload the computer, which for some reason it has absolutely no plan to countermand, and then it sort of just ends for no real reason. It's almost as if Ling had finished the script and then it went, oh fuck yeah, I need to do an ending. Or perhaps it was a casualty of reduced episode lengths and there wasn't enough time to balance the plot throughout the episodes, who knows. Having said all that, I do like that where the computer has come from and why it wants to turn the Earth into fiction or whatever is a mystery and remains as a mystery. It would have been too easy to just succumb to the temptation of explaining everything, but leaving it unclear means the early surrealism is never entirely lost. I do also like the conflict between the Master and the computer, the former desperately wanting his way out and the computer putting its own self-preservation ahead of his wishes. It's a nice look into the dual nature of the Master of Fiction as both a villain and a victim. But unfortunately there's not quite as much to it as I would have liked. There are also some things some dislike I don't really mind. Where the right robots come from is never explained, but that's a pretty minor thing, I don't really care about that. Sometimes stuff just serves the plot, and if it's just one thing like this, then whatever. If it was put in the story that was lazy in other places as well, I'd mind more, but it's clearly not the case. The carcass is too silly for some, but as I said, I like him as a send-up of pulp sci-fi villains, and the idea that some of the fictional characters are real, Blackbeard for instance, or in the Hugh universe, amusingly enough Medusa, but it's easy to just say they're fictionalised versions of the real people. If I write a story about Winston Churchill and Gandhi protecting Neil Armstrong from moon zombies, then they're obviously not going to be the real versions of those people, they're just fictional characters based on them. So yeah, that's fine with me. So overall, my biggest issue is that the narrative is a bit of a jumble and doesn't quite work as a coherent story. As I said, it's most of the way there, but not quite. Which is a shame, as I don't think it would have taken too much to get there. A tidying up at the ending and restructuring some in the middle of the story, and that's basically it. But oh well. As I said, the issues in production may have contributed to this. It might sound odd to say that a disjointed narrative is a comparatively minor thing, but in this story, it honestly is to a pretty good decent extent. It's a story that works on the back of 2 major elements, both related to character. Fictional characters and real characters. Who are also fictional, of course, but you get what I mean. The first relates into the fact that whatever Ling might have done right and wrong in this script, he clearly had absolutely no end of fantastic ideas for this story. And bringing in these fictional characters so that so many of them have a chance to shine is one. For a start, the sheer number of fictional characters drawn upon is very impressive, even more so as they're rarely there just to be eye candy and nothing else. They all interact with our heroes and through them allow the plot to advance. Rapunzel's appearance, for instance, is very much a moment of look at this fictional character, but that's the start of her reason for being here, and not the end. She's there to help Jamie up into the castle, and her interactions with him allow him to start understanding what's going on more clearly. It also presents the question of how much agency these fictional characters have. Her helping Jamie clearly doesn't advance the cause of the Master much, so they're not permanently under his control, but instead other factors influence them more. I'll touch on this in a minute. It does bring up the question of the nature of these fictional characters, and wisely contributes to the mystery by leaving it unanswered. Gulliver is a great success of the piece, played by the always great Bernard Horsfall, who of course later on played one of the prosecuting Time Lords in the next year in the War Games, and then Goff in The Deadly Assassin. Now, personally I think it's a good bit of headcanon to say the Time Lord in the War Games is Goff, as it does make quite a bit of sense and contributes to the formation of the universe. I have, however, heard that there are apparently those who think Gulliver is also Goff. To which I can but answer, really? I'm convinced nobody actually thinks this, and it's simply a viewpoint that's been completely invented to be mad at, but then again, Doctor Who fans being Doctor Who fans. Anyway, where was I? Oh yeah, Gulliver has another great idea, in that he only speaks lines that the actual fictional Gulliver said in the book about his travels, the name of which temporarily escapes me. Now this is a gimmick that could have quite easily backfired, but it works because of how naturally the dialogue flows around it, and indeed how the character of Gulliver naturally lends himself to being asked things that can be replied to with passages from the book. Indeed, it's again looking at the question of their agency. Is Gulliver helping our heroes as he does because it's in his character as it was in the fiction he comes from, just as if Rapunzel helping Jamie is a part of her character and thinking he's a prince come to rescue her, or is there more to it? Gulliver managed to be compelling as a result of this, an ally of our heroes perhaps because he has no choice, he can only say lines written in the source material, and that material doesn't allow him to portray them. Again, it's left open-ended, which allows for a compelling character dynamics and mystery. It's also quite impressive that, really, in the days before you could just Control F this sort of thing, Ling went through the entire of Gulliver's travels and managed to select lines that he would be able to use in his script. I mean, that is dedication. Anyway, the other part of what I'd like to highlight are the real characters, which shouldn't be too difficult. There only are 4 in the story, the 3 regulars and the Master, who I already touched upon. So essentially we're looking at how the regulars are dealt with here. This requires a quick look at where we were with the regulars at this point in the show. Season 5 had been the season of the Second Doctor, Jamie and Victoria. The Doctor was there to use his intelligence and cunning, but also his ability to act according to his instincts. Jamie, of course, wasn't the brightest, but he made up for that as an extremely well-honed instincts, allowing him to keep up with the plot and have much agency of his own. The obvious third side of the triangle would therefore have been someone who was extremely intelligent, but lacking an instinct. That's not really what they had in Victoria, who was essentially a leftover of the previous female companion archetype. She had her moments, of course, she wasn't stupid by any means, it's just she was there to, well, scream a lot. And that wasn't necessarily a problem by itself, as it did lean into her character arc as someone who had to go with the Doctor really without much of a choice due to the death of her father, and realised more and more along the way this life wasn't for her. And to be fair, it also did lead to character stuff for the other two, the Doctor demonstrating he always had her best interests at heart by happily letting her go at the end of Fury from the Deep, while Jamie, who had come to care for her more personally, was less willing to do so. Therefore, I do like the character of Victoria, but it was obvious she was a square peg in the round hole that the Doctor-Jamie dynamic had resulted in. Therefore, introducing Zoe in the Wheel in Space was a pretty natural move, as she was the round peg in the round hole and pretty much being exactly the character I mentioned earlier to a T. Extremely intelligent, perhaps in some ways more so than the Doctor, but lacking in any real instinctive experience. As the Wheel in Space had to introduce her, and the Dominators was more interested in waving its fist at those dirty hippies rather than doing anything like develop character, the Mind Robber was the first opportunity this dynamic had to develop, to show that Jamie's instincts and Zoe's book smarts could be balanced by the Doctor having both honed. A great example of this is in episode 1, when Jamie and Zoe leave the TARDIS into the void, with Jamie following his instincts of thinking, it shows I'm in Scotland, therefore I'm in Scotland, and Zoe thinking, well, logically I need to look outside what's going on, and it takes the Doctor to go, no you fucking dumbasses. Equally, the cliffhanger to episode 2 is a good demonstration of this. They're being charged by the unicorn, Zoe's logical brain tells her, well, logically a unicorn running at me with its big horn that could stab me is not a great idea, and therefore I should get the fuck out of here forthwith. While Jamie's instincts tell him, hey, there's a fucking beastie lad, let's get the fuck out of here! But they're both wrong. The Doctor has learned that there's no real threat, and it's best to stand their ground. But he's not the infallible master who will always get it right when they get it wrong. The Jamie face thing does, as I said earlier, demonstrate that he can fuck up, perhaps because of his instincts leading him to overconfidence, and he has to hide it from Zoe, who returns the you dumbass when she finds out. There are all sides of this dynamic at play. While the Doctor and Zoe puzzle their way through the caves, Jamie is using his abilities to work out how to defeat and escape the toy robots. Again, Jamie is not unintelligent, he just has different strengths, and that can add to a character already well trodden at this point. It's pretty admirable. Development of Zoe naturally takes forefront though, and continues along these pretty familiar lines. Her photographic memory of the cave tunnels is superior to the Doctor's, but it takes his realisation of how to defeat Medusa to get them out of that. You get the idea. Some good stuff for the character of the Doctor is the best thing to come out of the finale of the story, as his wits are tested very quickly by a machine that's essentially his match. He has to work out that he cannot influence the story without becoming part of it, and indeed, he works it out that becoming part of the computer means he can influence it. He's showing that the computer is right in wanting him to replace the Master, as he demonstrates perfectly the imagination and cunning that it needs, and yet he has enough of both that he can outwit it and prevent it from having him. The Second Doctor's primary character trait is his scheming intelligence, how he sometimes hides it behind his buffoonish exterior, and how he, and this is crucially what separates his scheming from the Seventh Doctor's, tempers this with his morals and his care for others. Part of his motivation in this finale is to protect Jamie and Zoe above all else. At no point does he think of them as pawns in his game, as the Seventh frequently did with Ace. And his faith in them is rewarded, as they combine their strengths to free him and save the day. I just wish he'd been a bit stronger ending than mash some buttons, but still, it's nice to see that in a story based on surrealism to this extent, the basics of character development remain. Finally, I would just like to touch on a very small thing, and that's basically imagination like this has to be appreciated sometimes. As I said, it's a pretty high concept story. The Doctor and friends go into a land entirely created by fiction, but it manages to be so imaginative and creative as a result of that. As I said earlier, after a year's worth of Based on the Sea stories, this must have been appreciated by everyone involved. And again, I really love a lot of those Based on the Sea stories, but something this creative and interesting certainly would have been welcome, and that's probably a good reason why it's so highly regarded. So, to the final score. Bearing in mind, this is a measure of how this story compares with all other Classic Who stories and nothing more. This isn't a comparison with any other show, even New Who, it's just comparing it to the rest of Classic Who. The final score for Mind Robber is 7 out of 10. It's a great piece, creative, surreal, and with some great character dynamics to make it a thoroughly entertaining ride. No, it's not perfect, less than stellarly executed narrative and a rushed ending, and I feel like it was probably a draft or two away from being really, really great, but especially considering the conditions it was made under, it's a very effective piece, one that I think very much deserves its title as a highlight of this era. Just because there's room for improvement, it doesn't mean what's already there isn't special, and the Mind Robber is definitely something special in this regard.